Well, we're 8 days away from the 50% tariff deadline with the US. And guess what? Washington's already lost the one thing it actually needed from this fight: leverage. American booze sales in Canada didn't drop because Ottawa passed a law. They dropped 81% because millions of Canadians decided on their own to stop buying.
That's over $500 million in lost sales, and nobody in government told anyone to do it. That's the part that should actually worry the White House. Sure, you can negotiate with the Prime Minister, but you cannot negotiate with an entire country that's simply done shopping American. And that's before we even get to the energy, potash, or the defense contracts that Canada's already pulling off the table.
And that's really the whole story right now, isn't it? Everyone keeps asking if Canada can survive the August 19th deadline like we're the ones on trial here. They're asking the wrong question. The real one is whether Donald Trump can afford to keep swinging at a country he actually needs.
When I watch or read about the trade war, all I see is that everybody wants to make this about GDP. They have 10 times the economy. Case closed. Canada has to fold. But what they fail to realize that it is about so much more than that.
Yeah, trade wars are decided about who can actually replace what they're losing, how fast, and how much political pain they're willing to eat while they try. And right now, Trump has 4 places where he genuinely cannot afford to lose Canada overnight: energy, minerals, consumer goods, and defense contracts. And then, hanging over all of this, is an American midterm election in November.
That's 4 major pressure points where Canada holds all the leverage. So let's go through exactly what that looks like.
We'll start with oil because the number, that's the one that's the most damning. The US pulled in 3.9 billion barrels of Canadian crude a day last year. US refineries are literally built around our heavier crude. Could the US replace Canadian oil eventually? Of course it could. But eventually is the key word here. Pipelines, refineries, and supply chains were built over decades around this relationship. And you can't simply wake up Tuesday morning and reroute millions of barrels of oil without cost.
And it's the same story with natural gas. 8.6 billion cubic feet a day flowing south through pipelines that already exist. And electricity? 2/3 of everything traded between the US and Canada last year was Canadian power heading in their direction. Whole regions down there are running lights on because of Canada.
So Canada doesn't even need to threaten to turn anything off here, although it might not be a bad strategy if things get really heated. Because the leverage right now comes from the US knowing that messing with this relationship costs their own consumers money every single time they try it.
Which is exactly why oil, gas, and potash got carved out of the new tariffs before anyone in Ottawa even asked. Trump's team, they did the math for us.
Now, we do have to talk about potash here as well, because this is some serious leverage for us. Potash, it sounds really boring, but it's really just fertilizer. And Canada supplies 4/5 of what American farmers use. The US Geological Survey itself flags potash as one of the highest risk minerals if that supply gets disrupted.
So, if you're a farmer in Iowa, Canada isn't some country your president is yelling about on television. Canada is the reason your crop grows next season. It quickly becomes less about rhetoric and more about your bottom line, frankly. Something that I think farmers understand the most.
And that brings us to another form of leverage that has surprised Trump and his cronies: Canadian consumers. That booze boycott, it sounds small beside like steel, autos, and energy. Economically, sure, it is. But politically, it has clearly gotten somebody's attention down south. American booze imports dropped 81% in a year, over $500 million out the window, because provinces pulled it off the shelves and Canadians, well, we just simply stopped reaching for it. So when somebody tells you consumer boycotts don't accomplish anything, well, apparently the White House did not get that memo.
Nobody in government ordered anyone to do that. Canadians just decided. And now, getting American bourbon back on Canadian shelves is one of Washington's actual asks at the negotiating table. Now, that's a real shift in who's asking whom for a favor.
Now, there's one important complication here that I want to mention, because what people don't realize outside of Canada is that Ottawa doesn't control most provincial liquor stores. Dominic LeBlanc cannot sit in Washington and promise Donald Trump that Ontario, Quebec, or British Columbia will put American bourbon back on the shelf tomorrow.
Which actually gives the federal government an interesting negotiating position. Ottawa can say, hey, we can talk to the provinces, but you're going to have to give us something worth taking back to them.
And Canada wants something substantial in return. The reported goal is relief from U.S. tariffs hitting Canadian steel and aluminum. And Prime Minister Carney is also pushing for a broader agreement covering major sectors, including auto and forestry.
And I think this is where the story gets distorted when people say Canada is giving in. A negotiation involves giving something away. It's a negotiation 101, come on. But the question is what you receive in return.
Which brings us to something that I think could become one of Canada's biggest bargaining chips: government purchasing. Canada is about to spend an enormous amount on defense. And for decades, sure, most of that money, it went south to American contractors, just by default. Prime Minister Carney's new defense industrial strategy wants to flip that. 70% of future purchases go into Canadian firms out of roughly $180 billion in procurement over the next decade.
Think about what that means from Washington's point of view, Dave. Trump wants countries spending more on defense. Canada, we said, fine, we're going to spend dramatically more on defense. But perhaps we're going to spend a lot more of it in Canada and Europe.
And sitting right at the center of that shift is the F-35. Yes, here it comes again. We already know that Canada originally committed to 88 jets through the U.S. program. The first 16, they're still moving ahead, but the broader order, it's still under review, and the government is seriously looking about whether to add those Gripens as a mixed fleet.
Now, nobody expects Prime Minister Carney to walk into a trade meeting and threaten to buy Swedish jets instead. Although, I would love it if he did. That would make a great headline and a great video for us. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that, and the security side matters. Now, everyone at the table knows exactly what's on the line if Canada increasingly buys aircraft, ships, submarines, radar systems, and military technology from Canadian and European suppliers instead of American ones. There are U.S. companies losing very large contracts, which will make some very angry donors very mad at Trump.
And unlike a tariff, that business doesn't necessarily come back next year. You choose a defense platform and you're often tied to it for decades. Canada's current F-35 plan, for example, is supposed to remain in service beyond 2060. That's a lot of dough out the window.
Then there's critical minerals, and this one should actually scare Trump more than the tariffs do. The U.S. imported about 80% of its rare earths in 2024, and it desperately wants to cut China out of that supply chain.
And guess what? Canada happens to be sitting right next door with a lot of what they need. And right now, Canada's building those partnerships east towards Europe and west across the Pacific instead of going south to the U.S. So every mine, every port, every long-term contract signed in a different direction, well, that's leverage that Trump doesn't get back.
Even tourism plays into this, quietly, but it plays into it. Canadian trips into the U.S. dropped more than 25% last year, and nobody in government told a single family to cancel their Florida vacation. People just decided on their own, which makes it almost impossible to negotiate that away. MarkCarney can drop a tariff with a signature, but he cannot order a Canadian family back onto a plane to go to Disney World.
And that's why we have to keep the boycott going, because we as consumers have leverage as well in this Kuzma fight.
It makes a lot of headlines and a lot of noise, so it's working.
So now we get to the political clock, because August 19th isn't the only deadline that Trump needs to think about. The American midterm elections are November 3rd. Trump doesn't go into this with very much political capital, let me tell you. Recent polling has put his approval rating near some of the lowest levels in his political career, with particular poor ratings on the cost of living.
But keep an eye out for Elon Musk. If he comes back in the picture, I'm worried that he's going to do something to the machines, just like they said when they won. But anyway, let's picture the calculation inside the White House right now. He wants to tell his base that tariffs force other countries to bend. But he also cannot afford another round of American farmers, manufacturers, and border towns complaining just as voters decide who controls Congress.
And Canada isn't just sitting across the table from Trump's negotiators hoping that they change their mind. Mélanie Joly says Ottawa is actively working the American political system around them. Mélanie Joly has been meeting American lawmakers directly in Boston. She's headed to Chicago, Texas, and Florida next, talking to the people who hear from local businesses first when tariffs start costing them money.
So Canada doesn't necessarily have to convince Donald Trump that his tariffs are hurting Americans, which is good because Trump doesn't understand anything. But it does need American companies, governors, and members of Congress, plus senators telling the White House themselves.
A Canadian minister asking for relief, well, that's one conversation. American governors and senators hearing it from their own voters, well, that's a completely different one. And that's the pressure that Canada's actually building here.
And Canada knows this, which probably explains why Prime Minister Carney has been unusually patient through this entire trade fight.
So the real message here is that Canada isn't going to win this fight because it's bigger. It obviously isn't. Canada will win because oil flows south, gas flows south, power flows south, potash feeds American farms, and Canadian consumers and defense dollars have spent decades propping up the American industry.
And every single tariff Trump fires off just speeds up Canada building the alternative. Energy heading to Asia, minerals partnering with Europe, defense contracts diversifying away from U.S. suppliers. Trump's own pressure campaign is the thing that's pushing Canada right out the door.
And MarkCarney's read on this has been patient on purpose. Keep talking. Keep building other markets. Let the cost of Trump's own policy pile up inside his own country while Canada quietly locks in the next 20 years elsewhere. Which is why August 19th isn't really about a bottle of bourbon going back on the shelf somewhere in Ontario. It's about who Canada answers to for the next generation. And right now, that answer keeps getting way less American.
You betcha. So here's our question for you today. Does Trump pull a taco and cave? Or does he swing anyway, knowing it will cost him votes in November? That will say a lot to me if he does.
That's a juicy one. So we want your opinion on this one because I have an idea of what you're going to say here.
And while you're commenting, check out the pinned comment for our merch store. We have some new merch for sale and our Substack, which is getting juicy, plus our A-Team and Facebook page.
And don't forget to like, hype, and share this so other people can weigh in on this and see who actually has the leverage in this fight.
It helps us out a lot. So thanks everybody for watching. Once again, we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.